We're going now.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Sir Bob Neal. I'm co-chair of the APPG for London and the MP for Bromley and Chislehurst. Welcome to the first ever online meeting that we've had of the APPG for London. You can't say we're not adapting to the circumstances. And as many of you know, but some of you may not, the APPG is a cross-party group that's committed to promoting London in Parliament and working together on some of those most important issues that are facing the capital. And what we're going to be talking about today is what I think obviously is the most pressing and immediate challenge that we have, which is the ongoing response to the Covid-19 pandemic. And obviously, public servants across London have been doing a magnificent job in dealing with that, as I think we all want to pay tribute to. But there are obviously consequences too that we're going to be talking about today. So to talk about that, we're going to be hearing from London councils. We'll be sharing the latest information on what Covid-19 means for boroughs' finances and the implications for London's local services that will flow from that. Also, you see our list of speakers there, and I won't run through them all in the interest of time, but we're also joined by a number of London parliamentarians on the online meeting, and they'll be able to ask some questions and make comments if they wish as well. And also, can I say that we're delighted that we've got a public meeting, in the sense that we've got a number of other stakeholders who are looking in, and I'm delighted to see that they're all with us today. So I know they've got a great interest in these issues too. So without more ado, if I move on to our first speaker, who's Councillor Peter John. Peter has been the leader of Southwark Council since 2010, chairs London councils, of course the representative body of London local government, and London councils also provide the secretariat to this group. So there's a plug for them there as well. So Peter, shall I hand over to you now then?
Thanks very much indeed, Bob, and thanks for allowing us the opportunity to talk about local government finance at this particularly crucial stage. Thanks very much. Could everyone hear what I just said? Yeah.
Yeah.
It was reminding me to unmute my mic, even though I thought I had unmuted it. Okay. Well, look, I mean, in the middle of March, local government was plunged into a crisis, as was the rest of the country, but the likes of which we'd never seen before. And it was particularly relevant for us in local government because it meant that we were required to stand up services that just didn't exist before the crisis. So the introduction of community hubs and the concept of shielding was new for this crisis. In my own borough of Southwark, there are 10,000 people who are on our shielded list in one way, shape or form. So having to make contact with them, ensuring that they receive, or a number of them receive, food parcels on a weekly basis, keeping regular touch with them, has been, as I say, a brand new service for us in local government. There have been other new calls on resources, but at the same time, we've obviously had to operate in a completely different way. From having an office on Tooley Street with, 2,500 people, we now have that office closed, and for the last 3 months, 3,000 of Southwark staff have been working remotely. Of course, there are staff who are still on the front line. And I think one of the great signs of some element of normality during this crisis has been the fact that bins have still been collected, our streets have still been kept pretty clean during this period. The crisis, though, has presented us with an unprecedented financial challenge as well. Across London, the cost of the additional services in the first couple of months or the first 3 months of this crisis was something in the order of £600 million. Now, the government has obviously brought forward 2 tranches of support for local government, 2 tranches of £1.6 billion nationally, but London's share of that has been £500 million across all of London's boroughs. So even over this 3-month period, there's been a shortfall of kind of income versus expenditure during the crisis of £100 million. Now, we are predicting much more significant losses over the remainder of the financial year, up to a total cost of £1.8 billion rather, and therefore that leaves a gap on the basis of currently announced funding from the government of between 1.2 and 1.3 billion pounds, a huge amount of money. In every individual borough, you'll find people working on the basis of a projected deficit, as we are in Southwark, of something like 50 million pounds. Now that is absolutely unsustainable as a kind of an approach to our finances for next year. It would mean cuts to our budget, or again of an unprecedented scale. We've dealt with austerity over the last decade, but I think the most we've had to look to find in any year has been maybe 25 million pounds from our budget. So finding something like 50 million pounds at this time would be a real disaster. Why would it be a disaster? Because much of the work that we have done over the last decade, not just in Southwark but across London's boroughs, has been about growing our local economies, getting people into the jobs, getting people the skills that they need. And we know that that work will be needed more than ever as we come out of lockdown and renew our economy for the remainder of this year. We know already in my own borough, unemployment has risen from the unemployment claimant count has risen from 3.5% of the working population to 8%. There are more than 20,000 of our residents who are currently furloughed. So will they be, or many of them face the additional challenge of unemployment when the furlough scheme comes to an end? We know there's been a massive impact on businesses. We're predicting a loss of business rates income that we collect of £125 million, council tax, people who just can't afford to pay their council tax anymore, of £11 million, a total loss of income of £148 million. Now, as lots of those business rates pass through our hands back to government and to the GLA and the mayor, as I say, our total losses that we're looking at for next year, £50 million. We are really keen to boost our economies again locally, to get people back into work and to get back to pre-COVID levels. But we can't do that, and we can't equip our young people with the skills that they will need for the jobs that are being created, we hope will be created in our borough, without some sound financial basis. There is some discussion that before the end of this month, the government might announce a third tranche of cash for local government. We need that. We need much more. Across the country, the financial shortfall is in the region of £10 billion. Given how much the government has spent on this crisis to date, I think it would be tragic if we don't invest that money into local government in order, as I say, to provide the services that I've been talking about. It would feel a completely false economy, quite frankly, and be damaging to not just my borough, but boroughs right across London. And it was interesting, I don't know whether anyone heard Marvin Rees, the mayor of Bristol, talking on the radio this morning, exactly the same challenges faced in Bristol as in London. So this is not a London problem, not a London issue, but the need to invest in local government and then to invest in the capital infrastructure projects that we need as a city has never been more pressing. So, what's our plea to government? Our plea to government is fund us and finance us properly. We can have a conversation about sharing the burden of some of these costs going forward. There is no one in local government in London who isn't prepared to discuss that, but we do need to engage seriously and soon, because the sooner that we have some certainty about our finances, the sooner we can concentrate on that core business of ours, job creation and looking after our most vulnerable residents. I'll just give a couple of examples of, and then I'll let Guy take over. But just a couple of examples where, you know, unexpected financial burdens and difficult choices. The government told us all when the crisis first arose in mid-March that we had to get rough sleepers off the streets, and London's boroughs have been amazingly successful at doing that. The funding for that has now kind of run out, and we have a choice as a council as to what we do. Lots of the people that we housed in hotels during the crisis have no recourse to public funds. Well, they do have recourse to public funds because, you know, they're being housed by us as a local authority. The cost to us as a local authority of keeping those people in accommodation through to the end of the financial year would be £1.8 million. We don't have that money. That would be a new call on our resources. But what is the choice that we face? We face the choice of throwing people who have been living rough on the streets back out onto the streets, quite frankly, or incurring that cost of £1.8 million. That is not a choice that we can easily make, or that other London boroughs can easily make. Yesterday, or Monday, the Prime Minister announced the end of shielding at the end of July. That's fine, and presumably that will mean the end of funding for shielding work for the end of July as well. But as I said to you earlier on, we have, you know, acquired 10,000 people who effectively have come forward and almost new and reliant on council resources. Can we just turn the tap off and say, no, we'll have nothing further to do with you from the end of July? That's incredibly difficult because there's still an awful lot of people who feel very nervous about rejoining society. Somebody was telling me only yesterday their elderly neighbour who has been shielded is incredibly nervous about going to a shop again at this time. And however many times we say you're safe, all is well, you can go, there is a reality about whether she will choose to go or not, and what support do we give as a community and as a society to people like that. There will be lots of people like that who will need that extra bit of support for that bit longer. And so I do think we need to have a conversation about how we carry on funding some of these additional services going forward. Anyway, Bob, I've gone on probably too long in terms of, you know, the impact that we're facing. I'll hand over to Guy Ware for a big picture as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. And my name is Guy Ware. I'm the Director of Local Government Finance and Performance at London Councils, and hopefully in terms of the big picture you can now see on your screens the presentation that I want to talk you through. To begin with, there's a bit of context. The numbers that I'm broadly going to show summarise for London as a whole the impact of the kinds of things that Peter was talking about in terms of the extra demand on London boroughs and the loss of income that's arisen from the economic clampdown. Those figures are derived from a series of surveys that government has asked all councils to undertake each month since the pandemic started. The numbers in my presentation were based on the survey to the end of May, and we have only just had the June figures in, so I will talk to some minor updates along the way. The other point I would make is that this is only for the London boroughs. The GLA and in particular Transport for London are facing a much publicised financial crisis of their own. TfL think that they're £4 billion in the red as a result of the drop in passenger numbers, and the GLA, the rest of the GLA more broadly, is about £500 million, most of which will have an impact on the Met Police. But to concentrate on the boroughs for a moment, it's worth just thinking back to the position before all of this happened, and back in February, boroughs were about to set their budgets, or had just set their budgets for this financial year. Their financial plans at that stage, at the end of or the beginning of the new decade, after some of the austerity budgets of the previous decade, we're looking collectively to save £400 million across London in the current year, but even more in 21-22. At that stage, they were forecasting the need to save £700 million between them. So that was a challenge enough going into this. And as Peter said, for Southwark, for example, that was about £25 million they were going to be saving. Then COVID comes along, and as Peter said, our current estimate based on those survey returns is that the total impact for the 33 London local authorities will be £1.8 billion in the current financial year. Now, as I mentioned, those are May figures. The June figures we just got in yesterday, it looks like that's pretty much the same, slightly higher at 1.9, but broadly same order of magnitude. Now that splits, as it does across the rest of the country, between additional spending of the sorts of things that, again, Peter was talking around shielding and homelessness, of about £700 million in London, and a loss of income, either tax or fees and charges, and I'll give a bit more detail in a moment, of 1.1 billion. Against that, we have so far received around £500 million in broad unring-fenced emergency funding, plus some targeted funds, much smaller but specified for particular service issues, one of which, for example, is so new, it was only announced this morning and embargoed till last night for some additional funding for rough sleepers. So some of those rough sleepers that Peter was talking about, some of the costs of keeping them off the streets will be being met through those more targeted grants. But the general funding underpinning the financial position of local authorities is so far approximately £1.3 billion short for London as a whole. When we look at the position to date, that £500 million was not quite keeping pace with the spending and the loss of income that boroughs were experiencing to the end of May. We've had no more since that point, and clearly another month has passed by. So we're currently, the spending to the end of June is approximately 860 million. So the shortfall against the money received so far is now about £360 million and counting. That's an average of over £10 million per borough. A bit more detail on what boroughs are spending and the income loss on the following slide. The two biggest categories of that £700 million spending pressure are adult social care, just over a quarter, and that's the issues around the in particular around the shielding that Peter mentioned, the numbers of additional people requiring care coming into the system, coming out of hospitals, and some of the unusual levels of support that have to be put around either them or the care providers, so supplies of PPE and that kind of thing. There's also a very significant chunk, a quarter, approximately 178 million of undelivered savings plans. Now, you'll recall I said at the start the boroughs went into this year expecting to have to save £400 million this year. Well, what they're telling us is that because of the crisis and because of what they're managing, nearly a half of those savings will not be delivered. Now, that's vital because what it means is that they will start next year already coming from behind to the extent of the savings that they've not been able to deliver this year. On the income side, the largest single category is sales fees and charges. Now, this is the side effect of the fact that local authorities are, in a way, an integral part of their local economies. And so when you close businesses and you tell everybody to stay at home, those people don't park their cars, they don't go to leisure centres, they don't submit planning applications on the whole, and so a lot of things that local authorities collect fees for or charge for are simply not happening. Above and beyond that, of course, businesses, as Peter mentioned, are not, many of them not able to pay their business rates. Now, a large chunk of that has been covered by government grant or reliefs, but a large chunk of it hasn't. It's a very significant potential impact on the public purse if those businesses cannot come out of lockdown and start paying their taxes again. When we start to get into some of the impacts on individuals, economic impact on individuals, the estimates become harder to foresee because so much depends on what happens when furloughing ends. There are currently 1 million Londoners on the furlough scheme, and as part of the returns to government, councils were asked to estimate what the caseload of working age local council tax support was likely to look like. On average, they're projecting a 15% increase, which is something like 24,000 people. But behind that average is a range that you can see on this graph between 5% and 75%, which is clearly in part reflects local economies, but in part reflects the huge degree of uncertainty about what will happen, as I say, once some of the targeted support for employees and the self-employed ends. By comparison, the bottom right of that slide, you'll see that over the period since March, job seekers allowance claims in London's have doubled, and universal credit claims have gone up by almost 500% across the capital as a whole. So there is a huge backlog and potential demand for support that will be coming through from those claims. In the meantime, boroughs collectively have made arrangements with approximately 60,000 households across London to enable them to defer their council tax payments or to extend their repayment of debt schemes. Now, of course, the key question there is how many of those people with support and advice will be able to recover from that debt position in future. The more of them who can't, clearly that is difficult and tragedy for them, but also a loss of income for local authorities. So looking forward, we're at a key point. Things are starting to move. Yesterday was obviously a very major statement on the loosening of the lockdown and the steps towards getting the economy going again. But in the meantime, we have local authorities, as Peter said, across the country, but in this case in London, with potential short-term cash flow problems, short-term spending problems where their resources, where their demand is outstripping their available resources. And you may well have seen a lot of debate in the press about Section 114 notices. That's where a local authority finance director determines in their statutory role that their local authority does not have the resources to fund its current budgets, its current spending plans, and therefore has to put emergency brakes on. Now, clearly nobody wants that to happen in the middle of managing a pandemic. It would be extremely disruptive. But the ability of councils not to have to reach that position is dependent entirely on expectations of how much further financial support the government is going to provide. In the medium term, looking into next year, those reductions in tax base, both council tax and business rates that I mentioned, will carry forward as a deficit into next year's budgets, and those increases in demand will effectively increase the cost base that councils are facing. Plus, let's say right back at my first slide, we need to remember that boroughs were already expecting to have to make £700 million worth of savings in the coming financial year, plus making up the savings that they've not been able to make this year. So there's a huge challenge, and there is no way that the boroughs can respond successfully to that challenge without further support. So the £1.3 billion we would want to see fully scrutinised by government and underwritten by government. There are reasons why all of this expenditure and income has been impacted. Those reasons are not in the control of the boroughs themselves. We need some of that urgently to prevent short-term crises, but more importantly, in a way, we need some certainty, as Peter again was saying, about next year's settlement. Councils are already planning their budgets for next year, and the sooner they can get some sight of the level of resources that might be available to them, the better able they will be able to do that without having to make severe and short-term cuts that will damage the recovery of London. So what happens next? The Secretary of State has promised a comprehensive package to ensure council's financial sustainability in the current financial year. That's my emphasis rather than his. Now that of course will be extremely welcome. We don't yet know the details of that or the timing of that, and as I've just said, the sooner the better as far as we're all concerned. But we will also need that recognition that this crisis will not end at the end of this financial year, and some certainty about the position going forward is going to be essential as well. The Chancellor is due to make some kind of fiscal statement or event in July. We're not quite sure the scope of that. It was trailed originally as a budget, but seems to have been downplayed since. But we would hope both to be lobbying the Chancellor and for you as London MPs to be able to comment on and influence that situation. More fundamentally, the Chancellor will be undertaking a budget and critically a spending round in the autumn, and that will be the key point at which the government spending plans are set for the next year or years. We again don't know what the period that the spending round will cover will be. There are also a couple of long-awaited but very fundamental finance reforms for local government that have been postponed by the crisis. The changes to adult social care funding have been long awaited, and the crisis has only emphasised the need for a complete rethink about how social care is funded in the future. And that is, of course, a key part of the pressure on London boroughs. The Fair Funding Review has been postponed. It was due to be implemented from next April. We don't know how long it has been postponed for, but we were anticipating going into that, expecting to see the outcome being potentially significant shifts of resources out of London and into the rest of the country. In part, that became part of the government's levelling up agenda, and I think I will leave you with the thought that that the Covid-19 crisis has highlighted, in the way that Peter explained, both the value and the importance of local public services, but also the scale of the need. The pandemic hit London first and in many ways hardest, and 16 of the 20 local authority areas with the highest rates of excess deaths have been in London. Now that's for a whole variety of reasons that we'll have heard discussed about what makes people most vulnerable, but poverty, deprivation, whether people are black or from minority ethnic populations, all of these factors play into those numbers and into the level of need for support from public services, and they feature very strongly, as we all know, in the communities within London. So whatever support package arrives to underpin levelling up, and whatever future financing systems we introduce, they must be aimed at tackling deprivation and inequality wherever it occurs, and that's within London as well as between London and the rest of the country. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Diana, my colleague, who's going to talk a bit more about support for businesses in London.
Hi, sorry, thank you. My name's Diana Neal. I am the strategic lead for enterprise, economy and skills at London Councils, and I'm going to talk about the London Borough's support to businesses during Covid-19. Just a little bit of context, but I won't dwell on this too much because I'm sure you're aware of that. The small and micro businesses are particularly important to London's economy. We've just got over 1 million businesses, but if you look at registered local business units, 87% of those were micro businesses, employing fewer than 10 employees. So really important to London's economy. And we probably we have lots of big employers. We also have lots of small ones which support local economies. We also have a large number of businesses and shared workspace in London, which has an impact when I talk about some of the grants and the gaps in the grants that have been to businesses. I think a survey by the FSB of 5,000 London firms showed that they had business rates included in their rents rather than paying it separately. Clearly, there's been a huge economic shock, and as Guy said, over 1 million Londoners have been furloughed, and actually the 5 UK constituencies with the largest numbers furloughed are all in London, and all in probably the most deprived parts of London as well. And we do know that, different sectors have been, some sectors have been particularly impacted, and some of these are very important to London's economy. The hospitality and tourism industry, for example, aviation, but arts, culture and leisure services, all really important sectors for London's economy, and therefore a real need for support. So what have London boroughs been doing to support local businesses? Well, one of the key things that we've done is to distribute some of the government grants, which have been very welcome, quickly and efficiently. And one of the hopefully lasting legacies of this is that boroughs really have got to know their business space and small business space a lot better now than maybe they did at the pre-COVID crisis, because we've been having to get funding out to them very quickly. The first tranche was the small business and retail, hospitality and leisure grants that the government gave. And London boroughs have distributed just over 100,300 of those grants worth 1.4 billion within 2 months, really from a standing start as well, in terms of identifying those businesses and getting that to the right place. I think we as London Councils and also many other organisations found that although really welcome, there were lots of businesses that were falling through the eligibility gaps in those grants, and the government did respond to that by providing some discretionary grants to local authorities to sort of try and fill those gaps. They had national guidelines, but you could set local priorities. We estimate, because the figures haven't actually been published, that amounts to around £83 million across London. It was around 5% of the allocated initial grant to business per borough. Some boroughs actually moved quickly and set up their own scheme. So Peterborough, Southwark and Kensington, Chelsea moved quite quickly to fill in some of those gaps. And I know that Lambeth has also topped up its discretionary grant scheme with some SIL money. So some boroughs have done their own thing as well. But the clear thing is, and what we knew is that demand for this support is outstripping supply, and there's still some clear gaps in provision. So, for example, Camden Council opened its scheme, and within a few days it had applications from 1,000 businesses, and it thinks that it can probably support with its allocation around 350 of those businesses. And that would be for grants of most boroughs are doing grants of £10,000 or less. You could do grants up to £25,000, but I think the majority of authorities are doing it at the lower level just because of the level of demand that they are seeing from businesses. I suppose another key area that boroughs are working on is around safely reopening high streets. They're supporting businesses with advice and guidance on that. There's changes to street layouts, trying to encourage more cycling and walking in our town centres. And clearly then issues around licensing and enforcement, and trying to be as flexible as possible on a temporary basis around licensing, but also then making sure that businesses are operating within the guidelines. In addition to that, a key issue in the short term is building business and consumer confidence. So balancing that clearly with the safety aspect, but trying to get people to go out and to support the economy. London Councils has been supporting London and Partners Because I'm a Londoner campaign, which does allow for kind of local campaigns as well. And a number of boroughs have been doing some shop local campaigns to sort of build on the fact that people have been shopping more locally throughout the pandemic for obvious reasons, but trying then to build on that as we gradually come out of lockdown. And then in terms of advocacy, we on behalf of the boroughs have obviously been lobbying government, and I'll say a little bit more about that shortly, but also we work with the FSB to ask landlords to kind of do the right thing as the rents due for the end of June appear, and boroughs themselves have been balancing that, been trying to be good landlords themselves in addition to that. But as I said, that there are still gaps in provision, that we feel that there are some businesses that are still not getting the support that they need, and that they're looking at significant financial difficulties and may go over. First of that is around some of the discretionary grants for business. One of the overriding eligibility criteria that the government has put in is that it's for businesses with less than a business rate value of less than £51,000. But clearly in London, that just reflects high property values, not necessarily the value of the business. So that eligibility criteria excludes almost 25% of London's businesses, but only 9% of businesses outside of London. So we've been lobbying to say that that should be increased to at least 100,000 for any future schemes, because it really doesn't, it's just really a reflection of our high property values rather than the value necessarily of the business. The government's provided some really useful and welcome support for employees and the self-employed. But in the last year, the GLA estimates that 100,000 Londoners have become self-employed, and these are currently ineligible and cannot claim through the self-employed scheme, and that amounts to around 12% of total self-employed workforce in London. So we've been suggesting that they should extend the grant support to those who could submit tax records for the last financial tax year. We'd also suggesting that they extend support to limited company directors who are self-employed, which is often a structure that is required by contractors, and again quite a significant concentration in London. And then finally, on the reopening of high streets, the Reopening High Streets Fund again was a really welcome grant from the government to support boroughs with things like signages and various other things, but it was the allocations for that were based on resident population and not the scale of the retail, hospitality and leisure sector. So you got some odd instances. For example, City of Westminster got less than half the funding to reopen its retail centres compared to Durham. So it's we're suggesting that they should be using some other ways of allocating that money, for example, business rates yields as a proxy for retail need in the future. And then finally, as been discussed, just acknowledging the resource implications for London boroughs. Many businesses are looking to licensing teams, to environmental health teams, to seek assurance that they're following the guidelines correctly and that they're doing the right thing. And this all puts more strain on boroughs' resources. So that's a very quick overview from me of the types of things that we're doing. As I say, I think as we sort of move towards recovery, I think there's a real opportunity to build on those relationships that local government has built with businesses and combine that local knowledge and make that part of the wider economic recovery. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ellie Shepherd. I'm the strategic lead for housing and planning at London Councils. And I'm just going to give a bit of information about the rough sleeping crisis that we're in at the moment. So obviously things are moving very fast. So I'd start by saying that this morning's announcement about the additional 110 million funding for interim accommodation is very welcome. And we await detail on that. I would like to put the context that even before CV-19 struck, London was suffering the most severe homelessness crisis in the country, accounting for around 2/3 of the homelessness in England and costing boroughs probably about 1 billion every year. A new flow obviously continues. We are working with the LSE on more specific costs of this crisis to build on what Guy was saying around the 50 million, because we think that's probably an underestimate. So most of you will be aware that London boroughs and the GLA have together secured emergency accommodation for over 5,000 rough sleepers and those at risk of rough sleeping since the start of the pandemic. This includes commercial hotels. Around 2,800 of those 5,000 are in hotels, as well as shelters, hostels, repurposed care homes in some cases, and a range of accommodation. Obviously, when it comes to the hotels, we'll need to gradually return to, they'll need to return to their commercial uses. So boroughs are already working to move rough sleepers into onward accommodation. Working with the GLA, Health and Government, MHCLG, we have committed that as far as possible, no one placed in this emergency accommodation should be asked to leave without an offer of ongoing support. I want to put another further piece of context, which is what Louise Casey said last night, that this approach has undoubtedly saved lives. There's been far fewer than expected infections in this extremely vulnerable cohort. And that compares very favourably to what's been happening with in the USA, obviously, but also in Europe as well. And this, I think, speaks to much closer partnership working with health on homelessness, which I think we'll continue and build on. And I think that the cohort is quite interesting as well. Some extremely entrenched and hard to reach rough sleepers have accepted offers of support who haven't been engaging with support services for some time. And that has given us the opportunity to wrap around other services, for example, drug or alcohol. At the same time, at the other end, we have some people being accommodated who would not normally present as homeless. For example, casually employed hospitality or even construction workers whose needs are very different. They're work capable and able to sustain a tenancy. So as long as they are able to secure further work, they don't need the same levels of support. Despite that funding announcement, which, as I say, is extremely welcome, and the cross-party commitment to this cohort, key issues do remain. So to really help sustain the good work that we've been doing here and embed the progress, we're calling for two very specific things, one of which is to consider the NRPF cohort, which Councillor John mentioned at the start of the meeting. We think that at least 1,200 rough sleepers accommodated have some sort of issue with their housing benefit eligibility due to immigration. So that includes a broader cohort than just NRPF, but it certainly does include quite a surprising number of people who genuinely have no recourse to public funds. So really, to support those clients, we're going to need some quite considerable movement from government. For example, a 12-month suspension of no recourse restrictions or other support. It's not yet clear whether the announcement this morning will go towards supporting that cohort. And the other thing that obviously is that we can provide support, we can help people secure tenancies, but they need to be able to afford and sustain those tenancies. So we do need further welfare policy change here. The LHA uplift has obviously been helpful, but now we're finding that clients are hitting the benefit cap. So we do need to look at that and also to reiterate what's been an ask for us for some time, that we would want to abolish the local housing allowance shared accommodation rate for single applicants under 35, because that we really need to be able to give those people accommodation that they can sustain. I think that sort of is a pretty quick run through of the key issues on rough sleeping, and obviously I'm happy to take any further questions if there are in terms of that policy area. Thanks.
We can't hear you, Bob. You're muted.
Bob, you're on mute.
Thought I got that right. There we go. Thanks very much, Ellie. We've run around quite a lot of important matters there. We've got about 15 minutes left at the moment. So let's see if there's any questions and comments. Let's start all from with our participants. I haven't seen anybody on the chat function asking to come in, but let me know or raise your hand if we can. Who wants to kick off? Any questions from anyone? And just say who it's to, but the easiest thing, which member of the panel will be the best way to work it. Perhaps I could just kick off. Guy, you were talking about the concerns about Section 114 applications. I mean, how significant is that? I mean, do you have a sense as to how many local authorities, councils are in that position, and when you think that might actually kick in?
It depends, as I said in my presentation, on what attitude you take to the likelihood of further financial support from the government. Because the brute fact is that if there were to be no more financial support, the vast majority of councils in the country will have exhausted their unallocated reserves, and then a debate as to whether the things that the money that they've set aside for specific projects could be repurposed. But the reality is we know there will be some level of support, and frankly finance directors and council leaders therefore are having to make judgment calls on the degree of confidence that they can put in that. MHCLG have invited any borough or any council in the country who feels that they are in that or may be in that position to talk to them directly to see what kind of help and support they can get. The minister said recently that they were not aware of any imminent danger of having to declare Section 114, but imminent is a rather elastic term. Since then, Leeds has very publicly said that it's facing a £200 million shortfall, and it will have to in the summer if it doesn't get further support.
Okay, and there's obviously going to be bidding for money when we do get any settlement. Where would you rank the pressures on London boroughs as opposed to, let's say, the Mets, counties, sort of top tier authorities, in other words? Probably slightly different in terms of the districts because of the adult social care functions and so on.
Thank you. As Peter said, this isn't a London crisis.
No, you saw Bristol, Leeds,
but it has had a particular impact in London, and as I mentioned, the scale of the health challenge in London has been higher than most, and the level of income loss from business rates is higher simply as a function of the fact that business rates in London are higher. So we, as I mentioned, the funding that we've had so far doesn't quite meet the amount of impact so far. In the country as a whole, it was broadly neutral to the end of May. So I wouldn't want to overplay it, but London is going to need additional funding to resolve this over and above, or slightly tilted towards London compared to the rest of the country, because the impact has been slightly higher.
And if the APPG is looking to make any representations, what's the sort of time frame realistic that we need to be talking to the department? Obviously sooner rather than later, but is there any particular timelines?
Yes, so there's an active current debate going on about what the comprehensive package would look like. That is being negotiated between Robert Jenrick and his cabinet colleagues. So any influence one can have, but I don't know the timescale for it. And then, as I mentioned, the key staging points after that are the Treasury announcement in July, and then the budget and spending round in the autumn.
Getting in before then. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful, guys. Thanks. Anybody else want to come in around that? Jack, can you see anyone? Sarah wants to come in. Sarah.
Yeah. Hi there. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much. I've really appreciated your time and your expertise today. I just wondered if you think that there's how much of a split between inner London and outer London boroughs there is, in both in terms of the scale of the financial challenge that they're facing, but also perhaps in looking for more support, how you perceive that might be distributed.
Is that another one for Guy?
I think it is. I don't think there is a clear inner-outer difference. There are differences between certain authorities within London, and again, that depends very much on the business rates position and on the nature of the local economy. So your reliance on parking income, for example, is it's no secret that will have more of an impact on Westminster than it will on Redbridge, for example. But it's not a clear-cut case of the whole of inner London is worse or better, less badly affected than outer. The distribution of resources so far has been fairly broad brush, and the two tranches that we've had were not hugely different in quantum between inner and outer London. The next time around, we are being told, and we need to see a more sophisticated approach that targets support in relation to the types of loss that have happened, rather than just a per capita allocation.
Okay. Bob, we've got
James. Yeah.
Yeah, from James.
James Murray. James Murray. Yeah, James.
Thanks, Bob, and apologies, I had to join this meeting late because I had another meeting, so forgive me if this has been covered already, but question to Ellie, nice to see you, Ellie, about the rough sleeping money which has been announced today, about the extension of the everyone in. Do we have, I know it's very, very early, but do you have any noise from government about how that relates to people with NRPF, about whether people with everyone in, it'll cover them or not?
Not yet, but that is a key question that we'll be putting to them in the coming days.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks. Any other comments from any of our parliamentary colleagues, Andy or Graham or
It's Graham from the other end of the house.
Yeah.
Several speakers said that the greatest need overall was for certainty. We must be at the most uncertain times any of us have ever known. So what's being done, and what optimism is there that we will ever get any record of at least giving local government some certainty at an early date rather than sometime in March? Secondly, again, in my experience, too often local government argues about how its share of the cake is divided up, whereas what we ought to be arguing about always is that the cake itself is not big enough, or at least our size of the share of the cake that we get. My third question and point, again, I was very pleased to hear about the greater engagement generally with the business community right across London. Needs must. What can be done to build on that and to engage business community in each borough and across London as a whole as our allies in lobbying government? Governments of all parties have been quite impervious forever about being lobbied by local government, but if they're being lobbied by businesses on behalf of local government, that will be something new, fairly new in my experience, and well worth pursuing.
Any of our panel got any answers for him on that? Who wants to pick up that one?
I'm happy to respond to the
fine,
latter point on the business, if that's helpful. I think certainly London councils prior to COVID-19, we did some work and developed something called Pledges for Business, which was really around trying to get boroughs to to look at ask how well they knew their business community, but also B, how do you create an environment in which businesses can thrive, and not necessarily just your economic development team, but as a sort of corporate entity. So your planning team, your environmental health and licensing team, because when you look at it that way, we do have a lot of interaction with businesses. And we got some of the business representative organisations involved in that as well to endorse that. So London First, FSB, etc. So we're hoping to sort of refresh that and build on that, and then make sure that as we discuss the economic recovery, that we can make sure that boroughs have got a key role to play in that in terms of business support. And on the second question about sort of linking up with businesses to lobby government around funding, again, that is something that we've done more of in this past year. So I think we have written letters around spending reviews. Prior to COVID, again, when we thought there was going to be a big spending round, we did a session with London First. I think Peter spoke at that, about trying to get businesses to just understand the pressure points that even then councils had around finance. So I think we will be revisiting those, and also things like, we did a joint paper on changes to the apprenticeship levy, because businesses were frustrated with the apprenticeship levy. We didn't think it was working very well, and so we've done some joint lobbying there. But certainly we'll be looking to continue that and develop those relationships, because you're right, it is important that government hears from different aspects of the community about the impact of local government services.
Okay. Any follow up on any of those?
Perhaps if I could just pick up on the optimism and the size of the cake point. Peter might have a political view on that. How optimistic? I am reasonably optimistic about the short term. I think the package that is being worked on will be significant. I don't have any real facts to back that up with, but just the mood music. My concern, as I flagged up along the way, is whether that gets us through a short-term crisis without addressing the longer-term issues. And I think the extent to which that level of pressure is going to be underwritten, I would be much less optimistic about. And in terms of the size of the cake, share of the cake point, I think that's right. I mean, there are some particular factors, as I've said, about London, but fundamentally this is a sector-wide problem. The LGA has identified the total impact as about 10 billion, as Peter said, of which 3 and a bit have been provided, leaving £6 or £7 billion needed. It's glib and easy to say, but in the scale of things, of what's been going on, that is not very much money. In London, as I've said, we've had £500 million worth of direct support to local authorities and 20-something billion pounds worth of support to London businesses. Again, the comparison, the scale of the comparison is huge, and we need to be making the collective case, I think, across local government that the crisis has illustrated exactly why we are so important and why we need to rethink the way we're funded in the future.
Okay. Any comments there? No. Jack.
I can't see anyone. Yes, coming in from the parliamentarians room, but we've got a few written questions.
Okay. Do you want to deal with those? Yeah, please. Yeah.
From our virtual audience.
Yeah.
Jack, there's a question from Seema. Could you ask a question on hardship funds? Seema Malhotra.
Around funds, yes. So questions we've received. Could I ask on hardship funds, Lord Harris, what allocation system of any extra funds would London councils want? And another one, is it how realistic is it to expect the government will finance the gap? And is this a good time for London to renew the push for devolution?
Right, who wants to take that? That's a big one, isn't it? Yeah, just substantial matters there. Okay, Peter, do you any views around that? Sorry to put you on
I
the
was,
spot.
I was just pondering. It sounded like one for Guy. I was absolutely
Okay, well, we
that,
can't pass that to Guy, and then we'll think about
Bob.
the devolution point. That's perhaps a bit more political. Yeah. Guy, do you want to financial side?
Okay, I think the two are linked. Again, I'm not the politician here, but my view would be the form of funding that we needs to reflect the forms of losses that we need, and that again is the way that we will manage, I think, through the potential intra-sector fighting. You know, if we can agree the principles on which we should be reimbursed, that will help. But in the longer term, I do think that this highlights the need for a rethink about the way that we are as a sector funded, and that requires a look and a review about how property taxes, for example, work in London with a completely different property market, both commercial and domestic, from the rest of the country. It makes absolute sense to me that any future should be based on a London property market rather than a national one, with all the distortions that brings in.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's always struck me as the most obvious, one of the most obvious ones of devolution, isn't it? Is the property-based taxes for raft of reasons. Yeah. Any other observations on that? Renewing the devolution bid politically, is this the time, or is it going to get lost in the ether at the moment, do you think? I mean, you can't do it without fiscal devolution, in my book. I don't agree with that.
I mean, I think interestingly, actually, Bob, I mean, the local government has you know, I say it's stepped up, but we have stepped up, and we have, and we're playing a pretty critical role in the transition and recovery process, above and beyond what I was expecting in some ways. And I think that's kind of reassuring, and I hope that it will demonstrate that local government can be, you know, trusted with a bit more responsibility. So whilst we might not get much progress on actual devolution at the moment, the relationship that is growing and kind of the status of local government is being helped all the way through this time.
Okay, that's a fair point, Peter. Yeah, Jack, we got anything else?
So the question submitted from Seema Malhotra, sorry that you don't seem to be able to join us in the virtual room, but Seema's question is, how are we going to handle growing debt and financial distress and resources that are needed for that, presumably by councils? Would that be one Guy has any thoughts on?
I'm assuming the context of that was the written question about the hardship funds, and we're talking about the financial distress of individuals rather than the boroughs. Not exactly my policy area, but as I've said, we are seeing a huge increase. There is one of the targeted funds that government has made available is for additional welfare, but the scale of that is really quite small. I think the longer term impact is going to be, how do we have to wrap support, advice, and basic care packages around those people who are most vulnerable, and as Peter said right at the start of this session, how that continues once the public health crisis has receded from the news and people's consciousness, but the demand that's been exposed by it hasn't.
Okay, yeah, fair point. Right, any other contributions? If not, it's one of the things we always like to think about is what we do going forward. I mean, clearly there are issues about getting swift movement and much clarity as we can in the circumstances around the comprehensive package, and making sure that the London dimension and particular pressures there are taken on board. I think that's an immediate first step. Would it be sensible if perhaps I, together with the other officers and the Secretariat, pull together perhaps a letter we can circulate for approval and then get off to government, picking up on the points that we've had from our presenters and around that for a start off? We can do that. Yeah. Okay, Graham. We can do that as an immediate action, and then perhaps we can also then, if you're happy to leave it with us, to review what other next steps might be necessary down the track. Does that make sense? Great. Any other suggestions or not? Okay. Well, look,
In
thank you
the
very much.
meantime, we will follow this up with a briefing and the presentations that we'll share
Great.
with all members.
That would be really helpful, Guy. Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much. Great. Well, that's been really helpful, everybody. Great. Very useful indeed. And we have actually recorded this, so I think we're gonna broadcast it so to other people who couldn't get there.
Indeed, yes, we'll do that.
So we'll get that disseminated. It's there for the records as well. So we can make more use of it going forward. But look, thanks everybody for joining in, and look forward to seeing you all at the next APPG meeting, which we haven't got a date for yet, but we will fix one up, I'm sure, before too long. So thanks everybody. Jack, thanks to you and the team for doing the organising.
Thank you.
See you soon. Take care.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.